Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're diving into the world of the cannabis flowering cycle. We got a ton of requests about this one, and we listened. We dove into all sorts of materials from beginner guides to academic journals, and let me tell you, it's been a wild ride already. I mean, did you know that cannabis pollen can travel for miles? Crazy, right? But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's get back to the basics and explore how those beautiful buds actually develop. To help us break down this intricate process, we've got our expert here who's ready to make the science easy to understand and show us why it all matters.
Happy to be here. Understanding the flowering cycle is really the foundation for anyone looking to grow cannabis successfully. Doesn't matter if you're a seasoned grower or just starting out. It's the key to a bountiful harvest. So let's get into it.
Awesome. So first things first, right? We got to cover the basics. Our sources all agree on one thing only. The female cannabis plant is the one making those buds we're all interested in.
Right on. That's why being able to tell male and female plants apart is super important. You see, male plants, they grow these pollen sacs that look kind of like tiny bunches of grapes. But females, they develop these delicate little white hairs called pistils. Knowing the difference is crucial because if a male plant pollinates a female, all her energy goes into making seeds instead of those potent buds.
So it's kind of like a strategic separation to get the most out of those resin-rich buds.
Right, exactly.
Okay, cool. So now let's talk about how a cannabis plant actually goes from a tiny seedling to a flowering powerhouse. Our sources go into a lot of detail about the different stages, but what I found really fascinating is that shift from the vegetative stage to the flowering stage.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. During that vegetative stage, the plant is all about growing tall and strong, putting all its energy into its leaves and branches. But then things change. The light cycle shifts, and suddenly the plant's focus changes to reproduction. That's when the magic happens.
How can you tell when your plants are about to, burst into bloom? What are the signs to look out for?
Well, one of the first signs is those pistils we were talking about. Those tiny white hairs. They usually pop up at the internodes. That's where the branches meet the main stem. And of course at the top cola, which is the main bud site at the very top of the plant.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those. They're so delicate, like tiny little feathers.
And as the plant goes through the flowering stage, those pistils will actually change color,
Hmm.
turning orange, red, or even brown depending on the strain. It's pretty cool to watch.
The shape of the plant changes too, right? Doesn't it become more like a Christmas tree?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The plant stretches upwards, reaching for the light, and the branches they spread out to get as much light as possible for those developing buds. It's all about maximizing that light exposure for photosynthesis, which is essential for bud production.
This is where things get really interesting. Our sources bring up this concept called sinsemilla, which is Spanish for without seeds. And it sounds like it's a total game changer for growers.
Sinsemilla cultivation is all about maximizing bud production and potency. It's simple, really. By getting rid of the male plants, you prevent pollination, and you basically trick the female plants into producing way more resin. All their energy goes into developing those cannabinoid-rich trichomes, those tiny sticky crystals that cover the buds.
Got it. So no seeds, more resin, bigger, more potent buds. But our expert was also careful to point out that sinsemilla doesn't actually increase the concentration of THC in the resin itself. It's more about the quantity of resin that's produced.
That's right. Think of it this way. It's like a shot of espresso versus a latte.
Mhm.
The caffeine concentration might be similar, but you're getting a much bigger dose overall with the latte. That's basically what sinsemilla does. It gives you a bigger dose of cannabinoids. But here's a key point for growers. Since sinsemilla doesn't actually increase that THC concentration, choosing a strain that naturally has high THC levels becomes even more important if you're looking for maximum potency.
That makes perfect sense. So now I know a lot of growers are really curious about the specifics of light during the flowering stage. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure, light is absolutely critical in the flowering cycle. During the vegetative stage, plants really thrive under a light spectrum that's got more blue wavelength. That helps them grow lots of leaves. But when they shift into flowering, they need a spectrum that's richer in red wavelengths. That encourages those buds to form.
So you actually need to change the type of light you're using as the plants grow.
You got it. Many indoor growers, they switch from metal halide lamps, which give off this bluish-white light, to high-pressure sodium lamps, which have a more orange-red light, and they do that once the plants start flowering. And for those who want even more control, LED grow lights are getting really popular because you can really fine-tune the light spectrum to match what your plants need at different stages. You can adjust the ratio of red and blue light to optimize both vegetative growth and flowering.
That's incredible. It's like you can give your plant a custom light show to help them thrive. Okay, so we've got our plants flowering, they're covered in resin. How do we know when it's harvest time?
That's where observation is key. Remember those pistils we were talking about? Well, they're your main indicators.
Mm.
As the plant matures, those pistils will change color, going from white to orange or red, and eventually they'll dry out and turn brown. The trichomes themselves will change too, becoming more cloudy and amber in color.
So we're basically looking for a specific color palette on the buds.
In a way, yes, but it's not an exact science. Different strains have different flowering times, and the perfect time to harvest can vary depending on the effects you're looking for. So this is where experience and a bit of research on your specific strain comes in handy.
Our sources really stress that patience is key. Rushing the harvest can lead to lower quality buds.
Right.
Absolutely.
See, it's like baking a cake. You wouldn't take it out of the oven before it's done. You want to give those buds plenty of time to develop their flavors and aromas and reach their full potency.
Now, we've talked a lot about the plant itself, but our sources make it clear that the environment plays a huge role in the flowering cycle. Things like temperature, humidity, and good airflow can make or break your harvest.
You're absolutely right. These factors are super important. We'll dive deeper into those environmental factors and how to manipulate them for the best bud development in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Can't wait.
You know, before we jumped into the break, we were just talking about those visual cues that tell you when your cannabis plants are ready for harvest.
Right, those pistils and trichomes.
Exactly. But now let's dive into those environmental factors we touched on earlier, things like temperature, humidity, and airflow, because those can really have a huge impact on your final product.
Yeah, you mentioned that cannabis plants are pretty sensitive to temperature changes,
Mm.
especially during that flowering stage.
Hmm.
Can you explain why that is and what the ideal temperature range is for them?
Of course. So maintaining a consistent temperature is really crucial for bud development. Think of it this way. Cannabis plants, they've evolved to thrive in specific climates. And during the flowering stage, they prefer a temperature range that mimics their natural environment. So ideally, you want to keep things between 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit during the day when the lights are on, and then a bit cooler, around 58 to 70 degrees during their night cycle.
So it's like creating a little mini summer for them, even if they're growing indoors. What happens if the temperature goes too high or too low outside of that ideal range?
Well, if it gets too hot, it can stress the plants out.
Yeah.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems like stunted growth, reduced resin production,
Mhm.
and even hermaphroditism, which is when a female plant starts developing male pollen sacs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And on the flip side, temperatures that are too low can also slow down growth and delay the whole flowering process. It's like Goldilocks.
Yeah,
The conditions have to be just right for those buds to develop properly.
gotcha. So temperature control is definitely something growers need to pay attention to. Now, what about humidity? Our sources talk a lot about how important it is to maintain the right humidity levels, especially during flowering when those buds are getting nice and dense. What can happen if there's too much or too little moisture in the air?
Humidity is definitely a balancing act. Too much humidity, and you're creating the perfect environment for fungal diseases,
Yeah.
like the dreaded bud rot.
Bud rot.
Yeah, it's also known as botrytis. It thrives in warm, humid conditions, and it can spread like wildfire, destroying your precious buds. And then on the other hand, if the humidity is too low, your plants can get dehydrated, which can also stunt their growth and mess with resin production.
So again, it's about finding that sweet spot, like with temperature.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so what can growers do to keep those humidity and temperature levels in check?
Good air circulation is one of the simplest but most effective ways to regulate both temperature and humidity. Proper ventilation helps to move that heat around, prevent stagnant air, and reduce excess moisture. It's like creating a gentle breeze for your plants, just like they'd experience outdoors.
So something as basic as a fan can make a big difference.
Absolutely. For indoor growers, using fans to circulate the air within the grow space, and then exhaust fans to pull out that warm, humid air is essential. Outdoor growers can choose spots with good natural airflow or strategically position fans to create a little breeze around their plants.
Our sources actually mentioned that having good airflow can sometimes even eliminate the need for more expensive equipment, like dehumidifiers, which can be a real money saver for growers. But what if ventilation alone just isn't enough to control those humidity levels?
Well, if you're battling high humidity, even with good ventilation, you might need to invest in a dehumidifier to get rid of that excess moisture from the air. They can be really helpful during the later stages of flowering when those buds are getting really dense and more prone to mold.
Makes sense. Now, apart from temperature, humidity, and airflow, are there any other environmental things that growers should be thinking about during the flowering stage?
Well, just like us, plants need a good diet to thrive. And during the flowering stage, they need a different mix of nutrients compared to when they're in the vegetative stage. They're putting a lot of energy into bud production, so they need extra phosphorus and potassium to support those processes.
Interesting. So you can't just give them the same plant food throughout their whole life cycle.
Nope. Many growers use special nutrient solutions that are formulated just for flowering plants. These solutions typically have higher levels of phosphorus and potassium to help those buds develop properly.
Got it. So what about watering? Anything specific to keep in mind when watering flowering plants?
Watering is important throughout a plant's life, of course, but during flowering, it's super important to find that balance. You want to keep the soil moist, but not overwater. Overwatering can lead to root rot and other issues that can ruin your harvest. A good rule of thumb is to water deeply. Let that excess water drain away, and then let the soil dry out a bit before you water again.
So once again, it's all about balance,
Yeah.
just like with everything else we've talked about.
Exactly.
Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground already,
Yeah.
but I'm curious, what are some of the most common mistakes you see growers making during the flowering stage, and how can they avoid those pitfalls?
That's a great question. One of the biggest mistakes I see is growers just not paying close enough attention to what their plants need. They might not be monitoring the environment closely enough or adjusting the temperature or humidity as needed, or they might be forgetting about those crucial nutrient adjustments.
So it really comes down to being observant and responsive to what the plants are telling you. What are some tips for becoming a more attentive grower?
It's all about developing a routine and making it a habit to check on your plants regularly. Walk through your grow space at least once a day. Look closely at your plants for any signs of stress or nutrient deficiencies. Check those temperature and humidity levels and adjust your environmental controls as needed.
It's amazing how these seemingly small things can make such a big difference in the end.
They really can.
All right, so now our listeners are probably eager to learn about harvesting those precious buds once they're finally ready. But before we dive into that, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned so far. So we've talked about those environmental factors, and now I think everyone's ready to hear about the best part, harvesting.
Yeah. Harvesting is like the grand finale of all your hard work. It's exciting, but you got to approach it with patience and precision. Because harvesting at just the right time can make a world of difference in the quality, potency, and flavor of your final product.
So how do you know when those buds are finally ready to be chopped down? Our sources keep mentioning those pistils, those tiny hairs, as a key indicator.
You got it. Remember how those pistils start out white and then slowly change color as the plant matures? Well, when something like 70 to 80% of those pistils have turned a reddish brown and they've started to curl inward, that's a pretty good sign that the plant is getting close to maturity.
Okay, so we're looking for mostly reddish-brown, curled-in pistils. But our sources also talk about trichomes, those tiny resin-filled glands, playing a role in figuring out the perfect harvest time, too.
Yeah, observing the trichomes is another important way to figure out peak ripeness. You'll need a magnifying glass or a jeweler's loupe to really see them up close. Early on in the flowering stage, the trichomes are clear. But as the plant gets closer to maturity, they'll transition from clear to cloudy or milky and eventually to an amber color.
So what's the ideal trichome color for harvesting? Is it when they're all amber?
Not always. It really depends on what kind of effects you're going for. If you want a more uplifting, energetic high, you should probably harvest when most of the trichomes are cloudy or milky. But if you're looking for something more relaxing and sedative, you might want to wait until a larger percentage of those trichomes have turned amber.
So you can actually customize the experience based on the trichome color. That's pretty cool.
It is.
Okay, so let's say you've checked those pistils, you've looked at the trichomes, and you've decided it's time to harvest. What are the next steps?
Well, first things first. You got to carefully cut down the whole plant. A lot of growers like to do this in the morning when the plant is fully hydrated. Once you've got the plant down, you'll need to remove those big fan leaves. The large, broad ones. They don't have many trichomes anyway. Some growers also like to trim the smaller sugar leaves, the ones around the buds at this stage, but others prefer to wait until after the buds have dried a bit.
Got it. So the plants are down, the leaves are trimmed. What happens next? Drying and curing right. I know those are important steps, but I'm not totally clear on what they actually involve.
So drying is pretty straightforward. You're basically slowly removing the moisture from the bugs. And this is really important because it helps preserve those terpenes. Those are the aromatic compounds that give cannabis its unique flavor and aroma. Drying also helps to break down chlorophyll, which can make the buds taste harsh and grassy. Drying usually takes about a week to 10 days, and it's best to do it in a cool, dark place with good ventilation.
So it's not just about getting the buds dry. It's about doing it the right way to keep all those good qualities.
Right.
What about curing? How's that different from drying?
Curing happens after the buds are mostly dry. You store them in airtight containers like glass jars for a longer period of time, usually a few weeks or even months.
Hmm.
This lets that remaining moisture distribute evenly throughout the buds, which makes the flavor, aroma, and smoothness even better. During curing, it's important to burp the jars every day. You just open them up for a few minutes to let some fresh air in. This helps prevent mold and ensures that the buds cure evenly.
Wow. It's amazing how much care and attention goes into the entire process from the moment you plant that seed to the final cured bud. It's like a true art form.
I agree, there's definitely an art to it. And just like any art form, there's always something new to learn and explore. The world of cannabis cultivation is always evolving with new techniques and technologies popping up all the time.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the cannabis flowering cycle.
Hmm.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of male and female plants to all the details of environmental control, harvesting, drying, and curing. I feel like I've learned so much. I hope you all at home feel the same way. We've explored how those buds develop, the crucial role of light, and the importance of controlling the environment. And of course, we dug into the art of harvesting, drying, and curing. And just as we wrap up, here's a final thought. We've focused a lot on the practical side of growing cannabis, but there's also this whole rich history and cultural significance surrounding this plant. So as cannabis becomes more mainstream and more widely accepted for its medicinal and recreational uses, how do you think those ancient traditions and rituals will adapt and influence its place in our modern world? That's something to think about as you continue to explore the fascinating world of cannabis. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.